Hello, this is Sam Curry,
And I'm Justin Reinhardt.
and welcome to Just Give Me a Trial, Please, where we discuss hacking vendor applications and bug bounty programs. And just kind of give a brief introduction to who we are. My handle is ZLZ, also known as Sam Curry, and I'm kind of like a full-time bug bounty hunter. Been doing it off and on for probably like 4 years now. I also run a security blog at samcurry.net where I kind of talk about like bug bounty stories and application security research.
Yeah, I'm Justin Reinhardt, or Shell. I'm senior analyst at Bishop Fox. I've been doing bug bounty off and on for a while now, for a few years, and I do not run a security blog at samcurry.net.
Awesome. So to kind of get right into it, in a lot of bug bounty targets, you run into a really, really awesome, but a really, really overwhelming *target.com. And when you see this, it typically means companies are like more willing to say like, hey, whatever we have in scope, whatever we made, like have at it, try to break in, we acknowledge that like we can get hacked in like a billion different ways. So, have at it with the scope. But a lot of times what this actually looks like when you start digging deeper is a lot of vendor applications and scope. And you'll see things like Jira, Tableau, Axway, and like a billion different ones.
Yeah.
And
It's just, it's a function of, Apple specifically, or Yahoo, or any of these being some of the largest companies in the world across multiple continents, multiple divisions, and all the different ways in which you have to like organize and split up your company, and all the tools you have to do that. So it's sometimes like if there's a vendor application that exists, it's going to be on a Yahoo or an Apple or a thing, right? They have like a /8. So any IP that starts with 17 dot it belongs to Apple, to give you an idea of like the scope, the massive scope they have.
yep. And kind of like to go into like the specifics of what like looking at these application looks from like a high level, like let's say you're doing like a sublister, like subfinder of like a particular, star dot domain, and you run into something which resolves to like a vendor, like, hey, am I allowed to hack this? A lot of times, if it's like a cloud hosted provider, the answer is no, you know what I mean? But if the domain resolves to like something that's self-hosted, for instance, like companies like self-hosted like Jira or Jamf or Jenkins or anything like that, it's a software that's running on their network, and you have permission most of the time to like scan against it, but it does get pretty blurry, which we'll talk about. And to kind of transition like those particular technologies. Oh, go ahead, Shell.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, it's one of those things where if it's hosted on Amazon, it's hard to like, that's kind of like the gray area, right? Where it's, you know, does the vendor, you have to look like, does the vendor like have other instances that are hosted on like a similar, on similar IPs, also on Amazon? Or if they don't use Amazon, like the vendor doesn't have in their instances hosted on Amazon, like it's probably, doesn't belong to them. It probably belongs to the company that you're hacking on.
Yep. It's like super weird as well, because it's like, if a company typically uses like AWS for all their deployments, and it's like, hey, this like vendor application resolves to like a similar like AWS IP. It's like, how do I know, what's what? And there's a lot of issues with those like sort of communication channels and trying to identify who owns what, or how to approach it. But most of the time, it kind of looks like this high level overview where it's like, you've got the vendor product resolves to an IP, or at least for the ones that are like in scope and you're able to hack. The IP will resolve to some sort of IP that's owned by that vendor via, like you can confirm via like ASN lookups or whatever. And when that happens, it typically means that popping these applications would like give you full network access to these vendors, which are the target, excuse me. And therefore, it's like completely fair game if it's in scope.
Mm-hmm. And from here, yeah, you can pivot all, the kind of possibilities are endless, once you get inside a network like that, like pivoting and moving around to wherever.
Of course, at the discretion of the terms of service for those programs, but yeah. And this meme right here is kind of, I feel like, explanatory of your relationship with these vendors. If you want to hack these vendors, a lot of times it's like it's kind of where the trouble begins, is like getting access to their product, right? If you see, like, hey, there's a solution for file service management, and it's like something you pay like $30,000 a year for. Ourselves as hackers, like, we're not going to be able to like convince the company to give us trials unless they have like a pretty serious security team or understand at least like the basics of vulnerability disclosure or bug bounty. And most of the time you get stonewalled, and it's like, I don't know what you mean by, do you want to try to hack it? Like, do you have money? Probably not.
Yeah, and in this end, like, we, like, as hackers, we're not making the company money, and if anything, by like trying to get us set up in an instance, if they don't have that sort of thing set up, we're taking away time that could be used for actual sales or actual, development or any of that stuff. And if they don't, so like a lot of times when you'll see something, it'll be like, oh, like the free trial requires you to talk to someone for 30 minutes, right? It's like you're essentially just taking up their time with a sale that's never going to convert. They're not going to want to talk to you. They're not going to be very helpful.
Yep. There's a reason a lot of these contact forms have @company.com for your registration. You can't use your Gmail, which is really sad, but at the same time, it makes sense, right? So I guess our job as hackers is to kind of find a way around that. And what most of the time it looks like while hacking is, you do a sublister or whatever, and you see these like login pages from the HTTP screenshots, and it's just login pages, like login pages and login pages and login pages. And it's like, what do you do at that point, and how do you approach it? How do you fingerprint it? It's weird.
Yeah, and I mean, you only see these if the company doesn't have like a real strong SSO or 2FA solution. If they have 2FA, right, like a lot of this it's kind of meaningless. Or if you have SSO, you won't even make it to see most of these applications. But yeah, but behind this is where all the goodies lie.
Yep. And that's kind of like the whole idea of a talk is the idea of like, how do you get past this point? I mean, this is like the eternal problem or ethereal problem, like what to do as a bug bounty hunter when you see these. And I think really there's only two steps. There's option A or option B. And option A for, how to hack these login pages is you meditate for 1,000 years in the mountains, and then you come down as Orange Thigh, and you're able to own static login pages with like crazy exploits. Or there's option B, where we find a way to interface with the company or find a way to like view the source of the product and kind of approach it in a more, a way in which as like an average hacker would, who is probably not going to be able to pull off crazy exploit chains. So kind of transition to that. What's kind of annoying though is the idea like, if we do, option B where we chat up a company and be like, hey, can I have a trial? You run into a sales guy who's like, I have no idea what you mean, no idea what you're talking about. But you're going to be receiving emails from them for the next 3 years about like some like talk seminar where they give you like a live demo of a product on like some screen share in 320p resolution or whatever.
Yeah. Get like 50 emails a day just from this exact scenario where I'm always invited to webinars and like for a product that I would never use. And you should make sure to use a throwaway email or at least like a Gmail alias so you can auto mark as.
It's wild, the number of like the amount of spam you get. But if we do want to take this approach, like kind of the issues you run into, right, is we've kind of talked about before, and this is more of a checklist, is like hackers don't own billion-dollar companies, we're not good sales targets. But the second one is kind of interesting, right? Who do you ask for permission to hack a vendor, right? There's like a lot of really interesting, like if I build a technology, which is a service for something like, let's say, some like HTTP, like a load balancer solution, for instance, right? And I build this load balancer instance, and it has like a login to manage it. But what if that technology like reaches back out to the vendor's IP space to like try to pull updates, right? And let's say I spend all day, hacking this particular application that's developed by a company, but it's being ran on like the bug bounty network. Like theoretically, like I'm hacking upstream to that vendor, and that's just like that's probably the most clear-cut case where it's like you have permission, you don't have permission, but it can get like really, really blurry for like who you're actually hacking, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the times, like establishing good like lines of communications with these companies are rough, either because they don't, right? If you to interface with the company, you have to first make it through like sales or support or somewhere like someone is. It's kind of rare to be able to just go to like security and get like have a good kind of meaningful conversation right off the bat. And like there's not a lot of like pipelines built out for how to do this kind of thing. So it's not a common occurrence for these companies.
Yep.
Yeah, and it goes into the fact that a lot of them don't want to be, they want to be hacked, right? You don't want to have to issue a CVE on your product. You don't want to have to like notify your clients that they need to update immediately. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
it's definitely like, yeah, super like, as hackers, I feel like it's like, oh, there's a company, as a customer, it's like, hey, there's a company without any CVEs, they must be really secure. But like as a hacker, you're like, oh, there's a company without any CVEs, they must have like poor relationships with the researchers, right? Like there being occurrences where it's like, I will like own an application and I'll have to contact the vendor and be like, hey, like I found a vulnerability in this while like hacking another company. Is there any way I could have access to like a demo so I could like hack it a little bit more, as I feel like I could help the vendor? And they're like, yeah, we'll see about that. And then they never do, right? And it seems more often than not, they avoid CVEs more than anything. Like they would rather not have to publish them for obvious reasons, right? And it's kind of like a weird relationship between like, researcher, vendor, and also target, right? There's like that weird triad where, typically the vendor only has that communication channel with the target and never really you. You're like the outside consultant party, and like they don't want to have to deal with you at all.
Yeah, we've been asked like, okay, like, thanks for reporting the vulnerability, but like, which client do you belong to? Like, we don't speak with anyone but clients. So which client do
Exactly.
you belong to?
Yeah. And it's like, I don't know. But to get into the particular case where we explored for Apple, for instance, we hacked this app called Pega Infinity. And sadly, we had planned to do this talk where we disclosed a bunch of vulnerabilities we found in them, but they have a 90-day disclosure window. So we're able to give like a brief overview of the methodology and how we approached it. And kind of let's get started there, where we'll discuss, what exactly went on. So to begin, like the story is like all of us are together hacking Apple, and we run into this like really particular 403 page. And as Shell said earlier in a conversation, the ugliest URL I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's all of the parameters are encrypted, and which is something I've never seen before in all my years of visiting websites. Uh, and yeah, but luckily it had some of these very easily fingerprintable pieces, and like especially like this PR web slash app. And initially I thought this might have been something, I didn't think it was necessarily like a web technology, because when we first saw it, we saw this 403 error. Um, and so with a little bit of digging, I found out that it belongs to Pega Infinity, which if we go and we look at like their marketing information, there's a lot of words here,
yeah,
and I'm not even after spending like a week like thoroughly digging through all different parts of this application and applications. I don't think any of us actually know what they do.
no,
Still.
no idea. Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the technologies where it's like not to disown Salesforce whatsoever, but it's the most massive application you've ever seen. It's like an application for applications. It's like layers, right? But Pega Infinity was like somehow more complicated, right? All of their marketing was like machine learning. Like this image right here, if you look, a situational layer cake. Like we have no idea. When we think about it, it kind of looks like this, right? You've got the cake, you've got the robot, you've got like the AI. It's like, what is going on? You really don't have any idea.
Yeah.
And luckily, though, we ran into, with actual, the way to actually figure out, like what a company does is like find their developer documentation, which is what we did. And we ran into this endpoint which listed, just via like Google dorking and whatnot and looking for particular things. It lists all these particular servlets where if you hit, that URL we originally had for 3 and you append them to them, you can like browse to different stuff. And Shell did a lot of this.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot of this. Shout out to Corbin for Get All URLs, which really helped. You find the right there, like where Pega is hosting their like demo instances or like hosting instances for customers, and you're able to look through URLs for that domain and find a lot of different very interesting looking URLs, and we were able to kind of piece together bits and pieces here and there and take paths, from other that belong to other sites and tack them on the end and see, okay, this works, this doesn't. Until finally we defeated Apple's WAF by using this alias endpoint.
Yep, and the way the alias endpoint kind of worked was like before a particular Pega version, you used to always have to have this like /PR servlet, right? And that would let you access like the login page and the index and stuff. But they said, this is kind of excessive, so they removed it, right? But what's interesting is that like retroactively, if you appended that, it would say, oh, this user is trying to access it using PR servlet. Let's just serve the old like index file. And that's exactly what happened, and we're able to defeat like Apple's very explicit like path WAF. And then to this one, we include this long slide with notes for testing methodology on unauthenticated apps to kind of like serve in the slide deck as like, here's like a list of kind of the methodology we follow. But I think for the actual talk, we could probably talk a lot about like the actual methodology we followed for Pega. And to kind of start, Shell was kind of the initial finder of this. He found like the initial recon, the domain, and how that works. So to kind of transition into like how all we went about figuring that out.
Yeah, it was funny because as soon as I found this endpoint that we could hit, I threw it over to Sam and I said, "Hey, look, this looks interesting." And before I did anything else, and as I was trying to dig for endpoints, he goes, "Oh, hey, look, here's an XSS here." It was just, it's just one of those things where it's just immediately after finding it, just kind of went to work, right, trying to poke around at all the different places. Got to find out like what can you do pre-auth, like what does it look like, and just kind of figure out how exactly it works is like the big first thing, and then find out what functionality you have pre-auth.
Yep, and it's really weird because like a lot of times I feel like when people like kind of assess web apps, they're like, okay, like here's this page and here's like this input box where like you can log in, right? And it's like, okay, I have this form and this form, it's login, maybe throw in SQL injection, like blind XSS or whatever, and it's like, well, it's kind of all I can do. But the reality is like a lot of these apps, like their authentication models are like really wild sometimes. Like we've seen like a lot of past research, where you have like path issues where it's like semicolon / lets you access like the index or login or bypass it. And it's like these custom web servers and like these custom like huge apps where like, there is unauthenticated functionality, but maybe it's just not super clear at first, right? And a great example of that would be like applications where you can like log in and generate like signed preview URLs, right? So that way you can like share it outside the organization without authenticating. But what's interesting is like, how do you get that, right? Like if I want to find that as a hacker, it's like, how do I go about doing that? Like you're going to need to pretty much like find a way to get into that application. So we kind of like took a step back and we said, well, in order to like hack Pega Infinity, we're going to need like either to find like like an Apple employee's login, or like B, get a trial from the organization, or C, what ended up actually working, finding credentials to like another instance of it that we could report and kind of like log in and passively check the URLs.
Yeah, and from here, I was saying before, where you take try to like test whatever endpoints you can find for pre-auth. This really helps you take that to the next level once you can actually log in, right? And then you go from having a very small list of just what you can discover, kind of using OSINT, to now you have all or at least most of the application to sort of sift through and click on all the things, go back, look at your burp history.
Yep. And it was kind of interesting. Like almost immediately we searched, like I think the search we did was like PR web / app, and then also like authorization basic. And like immediately there was like a, for an actual company that was affected by like, leaked credentials, there was administrator login to their Pega instance. And like this is really cool, as you can see, like we've gone ahead and we've been able to access like post-auth what this looks like. But of course, like this isn't our system. So what we did was like we immediately reached out to them, contacted them and said, hey, we were able to access this. This can be accessible by anybody, send like the typical email. But also B, our goal obviously was to hack Apple, but there's like a certain kind of restriction on what we like can and can't do here as we're, in someone else's organization. So to kind of transition to that, I guess before that actually, what's interesting is that this is at the point where we pulled endpoint and we were able to find a bunch of really cool bugs, but sadly there's that 90-day disclosure window. And I think in the future, if you stay tuned, we'll be releasing some really, really cool bugs that you can definitely add to your automation process for Pega Infinity. But to kind of talk more about like the ethics of like where you are in that flow, I'll transition to Shell, where you can kind of give like an overview of how to go about that.
Yeah, yeah. It's nice in this, in this instance that we were dropped into a staging environment, so we didn't, have to worry about anything being, tested in prod, like massively tearing up anyone's stuff. But basically, the gist of this slide is don't be a dick and keep track of what you're doing. Right? So, like, keeping track of what you're doing is great for both you and for the vendor and for, the target. Because there's been times in the past where I've hit an endpoint and I have, like I was just spraying, and I have no idea what I hit, and I have no idea, but it somehow gave me some other functionality, like enabled some other functionality, and I was like, well, I don't know what I did. I just know that I did this series of things, and then I came back. So yeah, being able to know what does what really really helps, and yeah, you can clearly communicate to everyone where exactly the bug lies.
Yep, 100%. It's like super like working with these teams. It's like very clear. Like a lot of times, like, hey, here's my IP address. Here's what I did. And most of the time, like they're very, very understanding. Like if you report leak credentials and you're not doing any like state changing stuff, and all you're doing is like passively logging URLs in Burp Suite, I feel like that's totally acceptable. You could argue like perhaps like the idea that like using the credentials in the first place to like try to authenticate would be bad and you should report immediately, but I don't really agree with that, as you need the proof of concept. But it gets kind of complicated, I guess. But it's up to you at the end of the day, like what lines you want to cross. If you feel like you've violated something or a company will be upset, then no thumbs up or thumbs down. It's kind of like obviously don't do bad things, but it's your decision at the end of the day.
If you're acting in good faith, companies will generally be okay with it, and just don't, like I said, it comes back to, like I said, at the end of the day, just don't be a dick. Just right, like realize that anytime a company receives an email saying, hey, security thing, like it's stressful for for everyone involved on the other end.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you gotta have to be like aware that not everyone's stoked to hear from you.
Yep, 100%. And kind of more information on like notes for post-auth hacking on a pre-auth target, which is really interesting. Like the idea of, you have a target which has like post-auth functionality, but you're not authed yet. Like you kind of have to like retroactively like put the bits and pieces together to try to find a way to, like potentially authenticate or like access functionality that you're not supposed to have access to. So like a lot of what that looks like is like, hey, like you scrape out the URLs that have cool functionality and then you try to find some way to hit them, right? There's like a lot of like, that preview functionality. How does authentication work post auth? Is there any like, can you generate password reset, links? Can you try to add like guest users or enable things? And like, what does that all look like? How does that all work? And lastly, of course, like, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, like, understanding all the pieces of the system and how they fit together, like building a working mental model of the application and all the application different flows in your head really helps you get a better picture of a target.
Yep, 100%. Like, there's been so many apps where it's like, for instance, like, you're never going to find like any bugs like pre-auth, and you're kind of stressed out about it, but then you log in like post-auth, and it's like, oh, here's like this directory that exists, and oh, I can access this pre-auth. How does that work? And maybe it's like an XML API or something, and all of a sudden you have XXE pre-auth, and it's just like, boom, the app is gone. And I think, we may add more to this slide deck a little bit, but for the talk today, it's kind of just like that general stuff. I think we were running a little bit low on time, but to kind of transition into the end review here, I think just overall, the idea of like hacking vendors is like it's interesting in the way of like, you're looking at an app which probably affects like thousands of people. So it's like a really complicated question of like, like who owns this application and do I have permission to test it? And then like, if you do have permission to test it, like how do you go about reporting it? If you find a vulnerability in, let's say like something like Atlassian, Jira, the obvious answer would be, hey, Atlassian is a bug bounty program, report to them. But what happens if you're hacking like Apple and Apple uses Atlassian? And obviously, you're like a bug hunter. You're incentivized to cash in your bug for the most money, like ethically, obviously. But the idea is like it gets very complicated, and in kind of our experience, it's just like a very interesting problem. So to see kind of how to go about this is just interesting to me. And then, Michelle, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's always neat when you have these bugs that affect thousands and thousands of different customers, from large software vendors to entire branches of multiple different governments. And like the flow, like there's a whole different talk that could be written on trying to go about and find all of the places where these things are that have disclosure and have bug bounty programs, and the best way to go about that, like Sam said. But at the end of the day, just it's all about having fun.
Yeah. Definitely a really interesting problem to see. And I think like one big last thing is just the idea of like, if you see a vendor application, I mean, it's no different than a regular application if it is like in scope for testing, right? Like never be afraid of like, oh, like CVEs exist for this application. It's like a known, thing. People try to hack this. I'll avoid it, because it's just at the end of the day as vulnerable as these other applications. So like, why would you not, spend your time on it? But yeah, I really appreciate you guys for watching this talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Shell on, Twitter or just maybe on the NahamCon Discord.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Look forward to hearing from you.
This was Just Give Me a Trial, Please with Sam Curry and Justin Reinhardt. Thank you guys for watching.